Good evening and welcome to our weekly book study. I want to first of all apologize for this excessive and additional sniffling that you might be hearing tonight. I have come into contact with some pretty nasty allergy the last couple of days, so that's probably going to affect this evening's session. The session is part of our usual and continuing outreach. We have a new Covenant House. This is intended to be an intentional community for Christians with a common purse, and we invite you to participate in our life, in our ministry, the way you can do it from wherever you are today. If you are watching this on a recording, you can, I encourage you to somehow find the time and a way to connect with us on Wednesday night at 7 in live, so we can have an actual discussion about what's going on in our book study. The books we are studying right now is called Christian Anarchism by Alexander Christianopoulos, which started it as a doctoral thesis, and his intention was to bring together in one place all the writings and thinking about Christian anarchism. Central for Christian anarchism is Sermon on the Mount, and there are 8 points in the Sermon on the Mount. And we just started the first one, which is the resist not evil, and very central for this chapter. And today we are going to go into the second of 5 points in this resist not evil section. Last time we spoke about the 3 illustrations that Jesus is giving us for how to respond to evil: turn the other cheek and give the other a coat and go the extra mile. So today we're going to get a little bit more into this idea of responding or reacting. The word he's using here is mostly reacting. But in other writings that we have had before, the distinction between responding and reacting has usually been that a response is something that's well thought out and not a spur-of-the-moment way to respond to things, while a reaction is the seat of your pants reaction, something you don't think about, something you just do automatically. But so here he is using the word reaction, but I think it's really a response. And in one place he does use the word response. So tonight he's bringing together 4 writers. A fellow named Wink, Eliot, and Tolstoy was his main writer who wrote the most. Baloo is another one. Don't claim to know much about any of them, but they have different views on this. But one thing that they all can agree on is that Christians are to respond in a certain way. They're not just going to let it go, but give what he calls a purposeful reaction, which is neither just letting it go and not responding with the same kind of evil as you receive, but a third way. And there are even theologians who advocate such a third way in even a wider sense than this. I think Tim Keller is one of those. for those of you who know who Tim Keller is. Anyway, so there's a lot of stuff in this relatively short section here. It's just over a page. So before we're going to read most of it, and it begins with a pretty long sentence here. Moreover, and this is after he's been talking about the 3 illustrations that Jesus gave. Moreover, a point which Christian anarchism and pacifists are keen to emphasize is that Jesus' non-resistance is not just some completely inactive, uncaring acceptance of evil, but a very specific, strategic response, a response which Jesus illustrates clearly with his 3 examples. And we talked about that a lot last time, that the responses are the opposite of what you would expect. So when somebody sues you for your tunic or cloak or whatever it is, then you give them the coat as well. And when you get stricken on one cheek, you turn the other, and you go an extra mile when you're only required to do one. So he says here in the first line, moreover, a point which Christian anarchists and pacifists, so he puts in pacifists in parentheses. So that indicates to me that he says that Christian anarchists and pacifists are not necessarily the same. There may be some pacifists who are also Christian anarchists, but not all Christian anarchists are pacifists. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on with the other examples here. Well, I think only Tolstoy can actually be characterized as a pacifist. The others are more, even one is recalled a militant pacifist. This is like an oxymoron. Yeah, maybe we'll get back to that. So he continues here. Here, however, views diverge among Christian anarchists as to exactly what kind of action is allowed and what kind of resistance is forbidden. See, I stumbled over that a little bit because I don't have the sense that Jesus forbids or allows things. I think, in my view, what Jesus wants us to do is to do our utmost, whatever we can, to enhance the well-being of our neighbor. So it's not a matter of law, it's not a matter of allowing or disallowing something, but that may be an indication that Alexander Christianopoulos is not himself a theologian, he is not a Christian, but he writes about it because I'm sure he has a pretty good understanding of what Christianity is, but I don't think he himself is actually a Christian. So some things are allowed and some things are forbidden. Let me see. Resistance to certain types of evil, resistance by evil, or any resistance at all. So some things are allowed and some things are not. And the definition of what's allowed and what's not is depending on the resistance to certain types of evil, resistance by evil, or any resistance at all, and that's the Tolstoy view. These very important disagreements are discussed in detail in chapter 4, so it sounds like once we're done with this chapter, we also have to go through chapter 4 in the book to get more detail. Here, what should be noted is that non-resistance is, as it is illustrated by Jesus, is a purposeful and determined type of response. Yeah, and already touched about that, and a little later it's going to say something like, yeah, maybe we'll get back to that. Wink, he's one of these four writers that Christianopoulos is talking about. For instance, as explained in the introduction, is not a Christian anarchist, but more of a militant pacifist. And they have that opposite. You think that somebody militant is something violent, and a pacifist is something the opposite. But I think I know what he means. So Wink maintains that an accurate translation of the Greek does not suggest the passive doormat quality, which many Christians cowardly adopt, but that Jesus' statement is arguably one of the most revolutionary political statements ever uttered. That's what he says that. He thinks that court translators turned nonviolent resistance into docility. So, in other words, he says that they mistranslated the word for resist. And that a proper translation of the Greek word for resist would be violent rebellion, armed revolt, and sharp dissension. So when Jesus says, resist not evil, he uses the Greek word for violent rebellion, armed revolt, and sharp dissension. This tripped me up a little bit the first time, but I understand now that what Jesus is saying, do not use any of these responses. Thus, according to Wink, Jesus was saying, do not strike back at evil or one who has done you evil in kind. That's what I just said, I think. Do not give blow for blow. Do not retaliate against violence with more violence. We have many times talked about this cycle of violence, escalating cycle of violence. Jesus, Wink continues, was no less committed to opposing evil than the anti-Roman resistance fighters. I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to here. The only difference was over the means to be used, how one should fight evil. There were sort of agreement in that they should fight evil, but the disagreement is about how. There are three possible responses to evil. As we just mentioned before, that there are three possible responses. One is the passive flight. Flight, yeah. So, in other words, lay down as a doormat and not do anything. And the second one is violent fight. So that's pretty much responding to evil with more evil. Or militant non-violence. This Wink's term, because he's continues with this militant pacifist vocabulary. Militant non-violence. So, and I probably think we'll learn more about that if we were to read chapter 4 in the book. For Wink, a correct translation of the Greek verb, and we remember that says something like violent rebellion, armed revolt, and sharp dissension, shows that Jesus was rejecting the first two options and recommended the third. So the third one was militant non-violence. He was not preaching in inaction, but a very radical type of reaction. And again, we would have to go to chapter 4 to get a better idea of what he means. Ballou, another writer, whose position is perhaps best described as on the cusp between Christian anarchism, and pacifism. So we already mentioned pacifist and Christian anarchism are not the same, but this guy kind of straddles both camps. Is of a similar opinion to Winks. Based on Jesus' examples, he argues that the precise type of resistance Jesus forbids is resistance of personal injury by means of injury inflicted. So that's the tooth for tooth imagery again here. He therefore believes the word resistance should not be taken in its widest meaning. And that's consistent with Winks' interpretation when he says resistance is violent rebellion, armed revolt, and sharp dissension. But in the strict sense of the Savior's injunction, which would consequently mean that evil is to be resisted by all just means, but never with evil. So then that raises the question, I think, is what are just means? In the previous book, the Plan B book, we learned about 8 just causes of war. So there must be a just response that involves violence as well, but never with evil. So I do not know. Both Wink and Ballou therefore seem to interpret Jesus' instructions as forbidding violent or evil responses to evil, but not necessarily political resistance as such. So I have to think that they would be advocating for non-violent protests in the streets. I don't know if they would, how they would look at civil obedience, but that's probably going to be touched upon in chapter 4. So now we get to Tolstoy, who is kind of like different, but he's also the main writer, and his main source is the Bible. I'm not sure that Wink and Ballou are Christians. They're not beginning with the Bible. They're beginning with some other sources, but end up with the Bible as well. However, Tolstoy, who after all is the conventional exemplar of classic Christian anarchism, sometimes appear to disagree. In his version of the Gospel, Jesus says, "Do not fight evil by evil, and not only do not exact at law an ox for an ox, a slave for a slave, a life for a life, but do not resist evil at all." So then the Christian Apologist goes on, and he says that in other places Tolstoy is not quite consistent with that. He does advocate for some different responses as well. Let's just see if we can find it here. Tolstoy seems to imply that there is a form of response, perhaps even a resistance, which might not be tainted by evil. Tolstoy does not appear fully consistent in his interpretation of Jesus' teaching. Sometimes he interprets Jesus' command to forbid all forms of resistance. Sometimes he interprets it to forbid only violent resistance. These important issues I will turn to in chapter 4. And yeah, we're going to have to wait till chapter 4 to really get an explanation of these variations in resistance. What is resistance and what is, what was that other word? Yeah, I can't get it. Yeah, so Tolstoy says that there is there should be a way to resist without evil. So you can't. But do not resist evil at all is the first thing he says, and then later on he says, there is a way to resist without being tainted by evil. So it doesn't here in this chapter talk anything about civil disobedience, but it does in chapter 4, and we'll get back to that. So the point to note here is that although there may be disagreement among Christian anarchists and pacifists about exactly what form of reaction is allowed by these verses, they all, Tolstoy included, insist that the Christian response is a very real and very radical reaction. So here he is using both these words, response and reaction, in the same sentence. So I don't think he distinguishes between one or the other. They're the same. In Bartley's, that's another writer, in Bartley's words, non-violence does not mean inaction, but rather means not being violent in the actions we do take. Thus, as Eliot appreciates, what Jesus offers is a genuine strategy which consists in both not resisting and doing more than is demanded. This is a form of action, a genuine, purposeful, tactical reaction. So, I think the main point is that you're not supposed to respond to evil with more evil, and you're not supposed to just let it go. You are supposed to respond to evil in these unexpected ways that he illustrates with, turn the other cheek, but not just ignoring it. So I think that's it for tonight. It was pretty intense, I think. So I appreciate your coming, and I hopefully see you back here next week for another chapter. And I think the next chapter is called, let's see, the third point in this Sermon on the Mount is, what happened here? Beyond lex talionis. So lex talionis is the Old Testament version of this, where you resist evil with an eye for an eye. Okay, so I'll see you next week, and thank you for coming.